I'm Nicolai Knudsen. I'm a junior research fellow at the Clinical College at the University of Oxford. Today I'm going to present a paper called Shared Action and Existential Phenomenological Account. The main question of this paper is, what is shared action? And by shared action, I mean our capacity for doing something together rather than doing something just next to each other. So if you, for instance, consider the people on the image here on the slideshow, this is two people dancing. So if you imagine that you are one of these people, it would be fairly obvious to you whether you were dancing next to this other person or you were dancing together with this person. So the task is then to say, what is the internal structure of our intentional activity that makes us capable of acting together? What is the intentional component that integrates several agents into a group agent? So in addressing this, this question, I'll adopt a somewhat non-standard approach because I will draw on the tradition of phenomenology, the line of thought advocated by people like Edmund Husserl, Martin Heidegger, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and so on. From a phenomenological perspective, there are two main problems with the standard accounts of shared action and collective intentionality, the subject-object mode accounts. And the problems, the first problem is what I call the intellectualist problem. And this problem focuses on which model of intentionality our account of shared action is grounded in or built upon. So the phenomenologists would question the emphasis that has been granted to propositional attitudes. So both the subject, the object, and the mode accounts take intentionality to be primarily a way in which a subject can hold propositional attitudes. But the phenomenologists would argue that although some forms of intentionality obviously involve propositional attitudes, this is too cognitively demanding, and this is the wrong place for our theorizing to start, because, well, intentionality, that's just our way of being directed towards the world, and we can be directed not just toward a state of affairs, but also different forms of other just simply entities, simple objects, and we need not be directed towards these things in a way that can be explicitly stated. And the problem is that once we assume that intentionality is a matter of propositional attitude, well, our corresponding account of shared action will be a complex set of propositional attitudes involving, for instance, common knowledge. And this is very cognitively demanding, and it seems, at least so the phenomenologists would argue, implausible that such a complex operation is involved in everyday experiences, just like dancing together in a nightclub, because when we dance together in a nightclub, we're just sort of in the flow, we're just doing things, we're just responding to each other, to the environment, and we're not thinking about it, and we cannot state in any precise way what we're doing, yet we are intentionally aware that we're doing it. So this is what I call the intellectualist problem. Second problem is the taxonomy problem, and this subject accounts like Gilbert's and object accounts like Bradman's are often taken to be theoretically incompatible positions. But at least this is a suggestion I will move towards in the end of the paper, is that perhaps these aren't really theoretically incompatible, perhaps they're just targeting different types of coordination. So in Gilbert, maybe he's just trying to describe a specific form of normative coordination, and in Bradman's case, perhaps he's just describing a teleological type of coordination. Well, if this is the case, we need not try to say which of these phenomena is the primary phenomenon for our account of shared action. Perhaps we just need a flexible taxonomy instead, a flexible framework showing how these relate to each other. So I'm going to argue that we can avoid these problems if we adopt what I call an existential phenomenological approach to shared action. Right. So one of the the recent suggestions in the sub-debate, or the phenomenological sub-debate in shared action, is that once we avoid this overly intellectualist model of intentionality, substitute it for a phenomenological conception of intentionality, we have at our disposal a different sort of self-reference. Then we can say that there's a form of implicit for me-ness that accompanies all of our attitudes. So there's a form of self-awareness which isn't a thematic self-knowledge. It's a pre-reflective sense of self, namely the sense of self that whichever attitude I'm holding, whichever perception I'm making, and so on, well, I'm always implicitly aware that I am the one having this experience. So there's a pre-reflective, non-thematic self-reference in all of our attitudes. This is a claim often made by phenomenologists. And when it comes to the discussion on collective intentionality, there's been a suggestion that perhaps this self-reference could also happen in the plural. So perhaps this element, this intentional element, could render some attitudes inherently shared attitudes. So I'm going to build upon this type of argument, although I will focus not on all types of attitudes, I will focus on action. And what I'm going to argue is basically that we should conceive of action as a way in which an environment solicits us to act. So an action is behavior caused by certain environmental solicitations. Now, in these solicitations, there is this form of implicit self-reference. So solicitations, well, that is an appeal to me to do something. Now, what I'm going to suggest is that we can build upon this idea and say that, well, then shared action is behavior caused by certain shared solicitations. And then the task is to spell out the different ways in which a solicitation can be shared by several agents. One way in which it can be so is that perhaps this necessary self-reference in the solicitation could be plural and not just singular. So that's what I'm going to argue. And this argument obviously builds upon Hans Bernhard Smith's notion of plural self-awareness. So this is how Smith formulated his initial suggestion. Plural self-awareness is pre-reflective, non-thematic awareness of our attitudes as ours collectively, in a way that makes the social sharedness of those attitudes phenomenally transparent to us, constitute a shared perspective. So, in my perception of a glass of water, there is this implicit for me-ness. There is this implicit sense that I am the one having the experience of the glass of water. Now, Schmidt's proposal is roughly that in the same way that there's a for me-ness that accompanies certain attitudes, there's also a for us-ness. There's also a plural self-awareness in this way. So in some cases, it wouldn't just be a glass of water for me, it would be a glass of water for us. So I'm very sympathetic to this idea, and I'm going to build upon it in various ways. But I think that one of the problems with Smith's initial proposal is that there's an ambiguity in his conception of plural self-awareness. Now, Smith builds upon the phenomenological tradition. This is where he gets this idea of pre-reflective self-awareness from. But in the phenomenological tradition, there are actually two different types of pre-reflective self-awareness. There's the first type of self-awareness, which you might call the minimal self. This is central to the work of Husserl, and more recently it's been revitalized by Dan Zahavi from Copenhagen. So this is the idea that there's a formal unity of the mind which is afforded by a transcendental subject, and this is what unites distinct experiences into a single stream of consciousness. So this is the idea that whatever experience I'm having, this is always an experience that I, in particular, am having. So this is what you might call the experiential self, which remains the same in all of these distinct experiences. This is a formal notion of selfhood because the self has no content. There's no other properties to the self than this idea that there's a form of with Kant we might call it a transcendental apperception. Now, this contrasts with what we might call the existential self, and this is central to the work of Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, and more recently Mark Raffel from Oxford. And the crucial difference is that the existential self is not formal. So although it is a sort of backgrounded sense of self, something that is not the thematic awareness of my perception, is still implicitly operative therein. Well, it's not formal because it's not the self-sameness of the minimal self. Rather, it's a sense of self that is intrinsic to our practical engagement with the world and with other people. So to put it roughly, in the existential self, I learn something about myself. It's a sense of self that has a certain content. So returning to the example with the glass of water, it's not just that I am the one having the glass of water, it's that the water solicits me to act, solicits me to take it up and take a drink, because I learn, I have a sense of self as the one who's thirsty, for instance. So I don't have to think about me being thirsty, and yet this sense of self as being thirsty shapes my experiential field. It shapes how the environment solicits me to act. And it's important that Smith's thesis is ambiguous on this point, because he has been subjected to some criticism by, for instance, Van Zahavi. And Zahavi has argued that, well, if plural self-awareness concerns minimal selfhood, so if it concerns the experiential self, it seems that phenomenal consciousness becomes a form of social construct. And as Zahavi has argued, this is implausible. And as it stands, I think this is a fair line of criticism, but I think we can avoid it if we simply take plural self-awareness to concern the existential self instead. Now, this requires, of course, that we say a bit more about what the structure of existential selfhood is, so which type of self-reference is involved in that, and how does this help us elucidate what action is. So Heidegger makes, on this point, Heidegger makes a famous distinction between in order to relations and for the sake of relations. And he argues that these two types of relations are always operative in our intentional activity. So whenever I perceive an object, say a hammer, I perceive it as something else, so as a tool of some sort. So I perceive the hammer as something I can use in order to drive in a nail, and I can do that in order to board up the windows, and I can do that in order to protect my family from the oncoming storm. So there's a bunch of teleological steps or a teleological network that shapes what the environment affords from me. So the hammer affords me to do these things because of this presupposed teleological network. But this is not yet a solicitation, according to Heidegger, because in any given environment, there's going to be a bunch of different affordances. Now, the question is, how does the particular agent tie in with these affordances? What makes one affordance stand out as significant or as salient, so in short, as a solicitation? And Heidegger's answer to this question is for the sake of relations. So I do all of these things, this is important, for the sake of being a good father and a good husband. So I pick up the hammer and start hammering, because in the end, I have a commitment to the project of being a good father and husband, for instance. So I'll simply call this commitments or self-referential commitments, because this is a type of self-reference. Whenever I do this, so whenever I pick up the hammer, I also implicitly encounter myself or get a sense of myself as being a good father and husband. So here I learn something about myself. So extrapolating from this brief discussion of Heidegger, we can now say that a piece of behaviour counts as an action if and only if it is caused by a solicitation in which a set of affordances are inflected by an agent's abilities and dispositions, and some of these affordances are made salient by the self-referential commitment of the agent. So this is an account of individual action so far, but I hope you can see how this ties this pre-reflective sense of self and action together. Now the question is, how does this translate to the plural case? So In the previous definition, we had two references to the agent. Now we're referencing the affordances and the commitments. And my suggestion is simply that both affordances and commitments can be given in the plural. They can refer to several agents rather than one. And if one or the other or both of them do so, well, then we have a shared action because it is a shared solicitation. Let me just try to show this in terms of both the affordances and the commitment. So let's take an example. I call it good camping. Here we have a father and a son, and they go camping. They pitch the tent together, and afterwards one chops wood and the other peels potatoes in order for them to cook dinner together. So this set of affordances, or this teleological network, well, has references to both of them. So in this sense, there's obviously a shared affordance, we might say. Now let's contrast this with bad camping, just in order to see whether the commitment part can also be put in the plural. So here everything is the same in terms of the teleological network. The only difference is that now the son is a sulky teenager. So he's moody and we don't know why. He decides to go on camping because he doesn't want to get blamed for bailing, but he complains a lot and he keeps a grim look on his face the entire time. So he's going through all the teleological steps. They remain the same. So the affordances remain the same. And yet it seems to me that something is different here. And what's different is that the commitment has changed. So there's a sense in which they fail to do something together, and instead they just do something next to each other. And the problem is that in the first case, the good camping example, father and son, well, they did something for the sake of them as a group. So they were jointly committed to the activity of going camping. But now in bad camping, the father might be jointly committed to doing so. He wants to do something together with his son, yet the son doesn't really respond to this or share this commitment. He's just going through the camping trip for his own sake because he doesn't want to get blamed as an individual. So in this case, I hope this shows that the commitment can refer to multiple agents, and so can the affordances. So this means that that both affordances or commitments can be given individual or in the plural, and they are analytically independent of each other. Now, if this is correct, we get the following taxonomy of individual and shared actions. And I'll just go through it very quickly because I'm running out of time here. So in the simplest case, we have just an individual affordance and an individual commitment. So that's basically me just going to the woods to camp alone. This is solo camping, not very interesting for our purposes. Then in the other corner here, we have an instance where both affordances and commitments are joint. Then we have good camping, which might call, or we have some kind of teamwork where there's teleological steps that refer to multiple individuals, and we do so for the sake of the group. In the case of bad camping, we have the teleological steps that refer to several individuals, both father and son, and yet the son is committed to this project only as an individual. He's not doing it for the sake of the group. And this also leaves room for cases where we have individual affordances or individual teleological steps, but a joint commitment. I don't think this is happens very often in real life. Yet John Searle has an example with a case of business school graduates where they collectively decide to go out and be as selfish as they can in the world. And I think this would fall in the last corner of my taxonomy. Because then we have a group of individuals who do things alone, in isolation from each other, yet they do so for the sake of a group. So just to summarize or restate my thesis, I said that shared action is caused by solicitations that refer to several agents, and I've argued that they can do so in two ways. One, they can be teleological steps or affordances that refer to several agents, and there can be commitments to these teleological steps that refer to several agents. And I think this, I hope this solves the intellectualist problem, because it causes us to conceive of shared action on the basis of something as simple as solicitations rather than complex forms of propositional attitudes. And I most certainly hope that it solves the taxonomy problem because it incorporates both teleological types of coordination and normative types of coordination. So, thanks for listening.